Here's another great example of how a shifting meta can really bring a card out of obscurity and make it much better. Rocket Scyther was more of a support card, even in the Prop 15 versions of Haymaker. It was still a little bit outclassed by its jungle counterpart. However, in the Rocket On format, Rocket Scyther could shine a lot more than its jungle counterpart ever could. Although it still had low HP and a pretty mediocre blinding scythe attack, it was now in a meta that was based around stall, and that Shadow Images attack coupled with Focus Band could make for some really great stall tactics. And because Shadow Images effect lasts until Scyther takes damage, there's only a 25% chance that it is going to take damage if it's equipped with a Focus Band. So you can actually get off those blinding scythe attacks over and over again without really having to worry about taking damage, because that Shadow Image effect again is going to keep going until you actually do take damage. Meanwhile, you can be dealing 40 over and over to your opponent, which is enough to knock out a baby Pokemon, and the baby effect only requires one coin flip, while if you have Shadow Images and a Focus Band on, your opponent's going to have to flip 2 coins and hit heads in order to get a single hit on you. Hitmonchan was in a similar situation where it never quite lived up to its base set counterpart until the Rocket On format, where the new shifting meta, and because it was part of a stall meta, really made that cross counter attack more useful. Because of things like the baby roll and focus band, this metagame was centered around one hit KOs. You wanted to make sure when your attack landed, it was gonna knock out your opponent's Pokemon for sure. So in this case, Rocket's Hitmonchan is almost always gonna be hit with 60 damage, meaning that cross counter has a chance to deal back 120 damage, which could OHKO every single card in the format at the time. So again, another great stall tactic that would make your opponent afraid to attack you for 60 damage. And if you came up against a baby Pokemon, then you could just start trying to get off those Magnum punches, because the baby Pokemon's not really going to be dealing damage to you, and that gives you an opportunity to deal damage before they can. And while these two cards make up the core of this brand new stall type big basics deck, there are a couple of other cards that really make it strong and let you adapt to certain situations. So let's get into those. So starting out with Rocket Scyther, I'll be running a full playset of those. Two of the ones I have are actually Japanese. I think they actually make the card look cooler, in addition to some of my favorite card art of any Pokemon card. Gotta love that Ken Sujimori artwork against that really weird red and green background. And then I'll also be running a playset of the Rocket's Hitmonchan. And one drawback of this deck is it doesn't have very many free retreaters in it. A lot of the decks at the time ran at least a few free retreaters, mostly babies, that could really help you swap out on your bench a little bit. But this failing of this deck doesn't come into play too much, just because of the versatility of each card. You really only need one energy to stall out with these two cards, so it was never a problem if you got stuck with one as your active. But Gligar does have free retreat, so it's going to be your hit and run attacker, where you can use that poison sting and hopefully get poison onto your opponent's active, which is going to make them want to retreat. If they have a baby Pokemon, you could potentially KO it with a poison, meaning that they're going to stay in and try to get another Eek off from a Cleffa and just die to the poison damage. Team Rocket's Meowth is more of a niche card that you're going to use very late game when there are a lot of Pokemon in play and you just really need to deal a high amount of damage to help close the game out. Miraculous Comeback is almost always going to knock out your Meowth, but it can be really scary for your opponent. It's going to make them think twice about filling up their bench, trying to set up, if they know that you're going to be actually attempting a Miraculous Comeback and try to trade KOs with them. Elekid is in this deck mainly for when you kind of get stuck with an active that isn't quite useful. That way you can just use Playful Punch and deal a quick 20 damage. If you have Scyther out and you've used Shadow Images, but you don't quite have enough energy to use Blinding Scythe yet, that's a perfect opportunity to use Elekid's attack, or ability rather, Playful Punch, in order to just deal some solid damage to your opponent's active. Pichu is great in this deck because none of these Pokemon really use powers except for Elekid. So if you want to pull Pichu out and start dealing spread damage, Almost every deck in the format relied on some form of Pokemon power. Very few ran without this, so Pichu is a great support card to just put as your active and deal a bunch of spread damage as setups to be knocked out by a Magnum Punch or a Blinding Scythe later on. Professor Elm is in this deck mainly for stability. As you notice, this deck doesn't run Cleffa. It's one of the only Neo decks not to. And I chose to do that because I like to run this deck more reliant on draw power. That's why Bill's Teleporter is in here. It's not as reliable as Bill, but this deck is already risky to begin with. I mean, you're using things like Focus Band, Shadow Images, Cross Counter. You have Miraculous Comeback as one of your staple tactics to try to scare your opponent away. So Bill's Teleporter is just going to let you fill up your hand with all of these basics that you need. That way you can get them on your bench. You can start getting your setups really quick. Master Ball is another great card for just getting basics out of your deck and getting them onto your bench. And again, everything really only needs one energy in this deck. So getting it out of your deck really quick, you're going to have the energy in your hand that you need so you can get your setup super fast. Double Gust and Warp Point are almost interchangeable for this deck. It's really dependent upon the situation that you're in and how your opponent's setup is looking. So if you're comfortable letting your opponent pick what they are going to bring out, then that's fine. But if not, you can alternate these two cards. Nightly Garbage Run is going to help you get back some of these basics. If you're going to be really relying upon Meowth or Pichu or Gligar in particular during a match, and those get knocked out, you're only running 2 copies of each, so you want to make sure you can get those back, that way you can reuse them. And again, this deck isn't really running any powers except for Elekid, and that's only the 1 copy, so Goop Gas Attack can be really helpful in shutting down your opponent for a turn. Most other decks are very reliant on Pokemon power, so that Goop Gas Attack can actually stall them out even further for a turn, which can help you shift momentum and get ahead of your opponent. And of course, 4 copies of Focus Band, you're going to be using them on everything. They work great on Rocket Scyther, Rocket's Hitmonchan, and especially those babies. That way your opponent's having to flip double coins. Full Heal Energy is in this deck because all of the Pokemon do require colorless energy, so why not have a backup for if they get a special condition placed on them. This format wasn't as heavy on special conditions, but they did show up every now and then with stuff like Dark Gloom, which would try to shut down Pokemon powers on your opponent. So the rest of this deck is going to be filled out with some grass energy and some fighting energy. And unlike a lot of other Rocket On format decks, this one's main strategy is to attack as soon as possible, which is going to be turn 1 or 2. A lot of other decks would wait until at least turn 3 before they could start getting attacks off, but because all of these cards only require 1 energy, that energy curve is so low you can really get ahead of your opponent and put them in really weird spots. Like if you start the game with a Shadow Image of Scyther, you've basically set yourself up for multiple turns of setup before they can even deal damage to you. And when they do, it's really iffy if they actually can. Say if Feraligator's trying to attack you, it's going to have to flip 2 coins before it can even deal damage to you. And if it does happen to knock you out, by then you'll have a Rocket's Hitmonchan that you can bring out and kind of scare them with a cross counter, because if that's the only Feraligator they have set up at the time, they're not going to want to attack a cross counter Hitmonchan in fear that that Feraligator is going to get knocked out and they're going to have to spend 2 or 3 more turns getting set up for another one. So this deck was very innovative in how it was based kind of in aggressive stall rather than defensive stall. So most players within the metagame weren't really used to it. This kind of knocked them off balance whenever they had to come up against this deck, because really the most they could do is try to stall out with a Murkrow. Murkrow would trap your active and basically make it to where you had to knock out that Murkrow before you could start targeting the more important cards of your opponent's deck. And this would give your opponent time to set up a larger threat, but this deck didn't mind it too much because it could handle Murkrows pretty well. It could knock them out in 2 turns if necessary, and Murkrows didn't really draw focus bands very much, and so you could knock it out in 2 turns without having to worry that much. And this deck was very reliant on coin flips. If your opponent was actually hitting heads, then this deck could get absolutely demolished early game. However, the entire Rocket Home format was based in coin flips. Special conditions could also really mess with it, because if your active is confused or poisoned, then you may not even be able to get off a shadow images or a cross counter, which means that your opponent could attack you freely without having to flip that additional coin. Full heal energy did help with that, but you've only got 4 copies and you don't want to waste them all early game. And as always, tell me what you thought, tell me what you want. Down in those comments, you're probably sick of seeing Scyther and Hitmonchan by now if you've been following my videos for a while, but hey, at least there's not a viable Wigglytuff in this format. Bye.